The world saw Alexander Knight as an untouchable force, a billionaire CEO whose presence alone sent shivers down the spine of anyone in his path. Ruthless, brilliant, and cold as ice. But beneath the layers of his tailored suits and intimidating silence, there was a secret buried so deep that no one dared to question it. He had not touched a woman in 20 years. No one knew why. No one dared to ask. Some whispered that he despised intimacy, while others believed he was incapable of love. Yet the truth was far more complicated than the rumors that swirled around him like shadows. And then she walked in. Sophia Hale was not the kind of woman who turned heads in an obvious way, but there was something about her, something that made Alexander freeze the moment she stepped into his office. She was not breathtakingly beautiful in a way that felt artificial. No, her beauty was quiet, effortless, and entirely real. Her soft brown eyes held a fire that could not be tamed, and her presence carried a warmth that melted everything it touched. She was supposed to be just another assistant, one of the many who had come and gone, unable to withstand the pressure of working under a man who barely spoke more than necessary. But the moment she extended her hand toward him for a professional handshake, Alexander did something he had not done in 2 decades. He hesitated. His entire body tensed as if he had been struck by lightning. He could feel the stares of his employees waiting for him to pull back like he always did, but for the first time in years he did not. His hand met hers, and a wave of something foreign, something dangerous rushed through his veins like wildfire. He did not know it yet, but Sophia Hale had just rewritten the rules of his carefully controlled world. And nothing would ever be the same again. Alexander Knight had built his empire on control over his emotions, his business, and his life. But the moment his skin met Sophia's, a crack formed in the walls he had spent years reinforcing. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. The warmth of her touch lingered far longer than it should have, sending a foreign sensation crawling up his spine. He released her hand quickly, almost as if it burned him, but the damage was already done. Sophia, however, seemed unfazed. She smiled politely, her eyes studying him with a quiet curiosity, and then turned to the HR manager who had introduced her. "I'm excited to be here," she said, her voice smooth, professional, but with a hint of something that felt alive. Alexander watched her closely as she took her seat across from him. He had interviewed countless assistants over the years, dismissing most within minutes for being either incompetent or too eager to impress. But there was something different about Sophia. She did not fawn over him, did not shrink under his gaze, nor did she try to win his approval. Instead, she sat upright, poised, completely at ease in the presence of a man who had been known to make even the most powerful executives tremble. "Let us get one thing straight," Alexander finally spoke, his voice cold, calculated. "I do not tolerate mistakes. I do not give second chances. If you cannot handle this job, I suggest you leave now." Sophia did not flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, with the faintest hint of amusement in her tone, she responded, "Duly noted, Mr. Knight, but I do not make mistakes." For the first time in years, Alexander felt something stir within him, something dangerously close to intrigue. He should have dismissed her arrogance, should have seen it as overconfidence. But instead, he found himself curious. And curiosity was a dangerous thing. Alexander prided himself on his ability to remain unaffected by the people around him. Emotions were distractions, and distractions led to weakness. But as he observed Sophia settling into her role, he found himself watching her more than he should have. She moved with an effortless confidence, responding to emails, organizing his schedule, and handling difficult clients without hesitation. There was no nervous energy, no desperate need to please, just calm efficiency. For the first week, he convinced himself that she was just another employee. But by the second week, he realized something unsettling. She was getting under his skin. It was not her beauty, though he could not deny that she was striking in a way that did not demand attention but rather earned it. It was the way she handled him. She never overstepped, never fawned over him like the others had, yet she knew exactly when to challenge him. Your 3 p.m. meeting with the investors has been rescheduled to tomorrow morning, she said one afternoon, placing a file on his desk without looking up. Alexander barely lifted his eyes from his laptop. I did not authorize that. Sophia, unfazed, took a step back and crossed her arms. You did not have to. They were flying in late, and pushing the meeting ensures they arrive well rested and ready to negotiate. That gives you an advantage. Silence. For a moment, Alexander simply stared at her. No one, not in 20 years, had dared to make a decision on his behalf, let alone correct him. His past assistants had been terrified of his reputation, afraid to breathe wrong in his presence. But Sophia? She stood there, waiting, as if she knew he would see reason. And the most infuriating part? She was right. He exhaled slowly, closing his laptop. Next time, clear it with me first. Sophia nodded. Noted. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him with an unfamiliar, unwelcome sensation twisting in his chest. It was not anger. It was not irritation. It was something else entirely. And it was growing stronger by the day. Alexander had always been a man of routine. His days were predictable, his interactions calculated, his life carefully controlled. But since Sophia's arrival, everything felt different. He told himself it was because she was competent, that her efficiency was what made her stand out. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. It was not just her work ethic that unsettled him. It was the way she carried herself. Fearless, intelligent, completely unshaken by him. And for the first time in years he caught himself noticing things he should not. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was focused. The quiet determination in her eyes when she handled impossible tasks. The way her perfume lingered long after she had left the room. One evening, long after the office had emptied, he found himself still at his desk, staring blankly at the reports in front of him. Sophia was in the adjacent room, unaware of his gaze as she packed up her things. He should have dismissed the way his eyes followed her movements, but something about the way she existed in his space so effortlessly unsettled him. Still working? Her voice broke the silence. Alexander looked up, masking his thoughts behind his usual stoic expression. You are still here. Sophia smiled, leaning against the doorframe. I wanted to make sure your travel arrangements for tomorrow were finalized. The hotel upgraded your suite, and I adjusted the flight time to avoid delays. He studied her for a long moment. You think of everything, do you not? A small smirk played at her lips. That is what you pay me for. But that was the problem. He was starting to feel something beyond professionalism, beyond the walls he had carefully built, and that was a dangerous thing, because Alexander Knight did not get attached, not to people, not to feelings. Yet, with every passing day, Sophia Hale was making it impossible to ignore the truth. She was becoming the one thing he had spent 20 years avoiding, a temptation. Alexander could feel the shift, but he refused to acknowledge it. His life had been perfectly structured, cold, calculated, untouched by distractions. Yet Sophia was unraveling that control piece by piece without even trying. The real problem began at a charity gala. It was an event he attended every year, more out of obligation than genuine interest. The room was filled with socialites, business moguls, and people who thrived on pretense. Alexander hated these gatherings, but tonight something was different. Sophia was there. She had not intended to attend. She had simply come to ensure his evening went smoothly. But when his date, a woman handpicked by his board to keep up appearances, arrived late, he found himself grateful for Sophia's presence. She stood near the bar, unaware of the effect she had on him. The dim lighting softened her features, highlighting the effortless grace she carried. She was dressed simply, elegantly, in a dark emerald gown that hugged her in ways that made it impossible for him to look away. And that was when he made his first mistake. He walked up to her. "You are overdressed for an assistant," he remarked, his voice low. Sophia turned to face him, amusement flickering in her eyes. "And you are just as charming as ever, Mr. Knight." He should have walked away, should have reminded himself that she was off limits, but for the first time in 20 years he did not. "Have dinner with me." The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Sophia blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Is that an order or an invitation?" Alexander smirked, sensing the challenge in her tone. "Whichever gets you to say yes." She held his gaze for a moment before finally responding, her voice softer this time. "All right, but only if you promise not to fire me in the morning." Something flickered in his chest, something dangerously close to want. And just like that, the unbreakable Alexander Knight took the first step toward his own downfall. Alexander Knight was a man of precision. Every decision he made was deliberate, calculated, but sitting across from Sophia in the dimly lit restaurant, he realized that for the first time in decades, he had acted purely on impulse. She was seated across from him, calm and composed, as if dining with one of the most powerful men in the country was just another ordinary night. There was no nervous energy, no attempt to impress him. She simply was. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was charged. He had spent years building a reputation that kept people at arm's length, yet with Sophia, that distance was disappearing. Slowly, dangerously. "You do not date, do you?" she finally asked, swirling the wine in her glass. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Is that an observation or question?" "A little of both," she admitted. "I have worked with you long enough to know that there is no woman in your life." "Not really." He could have dismissed her words, could have avoided the truth like he always did, but for some reason, with her, he did not feel the need to lie. "I do not see the point in it," he said simply. Sophia tilted her head slightly. "Because you do not believe in love? Or because you are afraid of it?" Something in his chest tightened, but he did not let it show. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "You think you have me figured out, Miss Hale?" A slow, knowing smile curved her lips. "No, Mr. Knight. I think you are still figuring yourself out." For the first time in 20 years, someone had spoken to him without fear, without hesitation, and for the first time in his life, he did not know how to respond, because she was right. Sophia was not just another assistant. She was breaking through him, and he was starting to wonder if he even wanted to stop her. Alexander had spent years perfecting the art of detachment. Feelings were liabilities, and he had ensured that no one ever got close enough to become a weakness. But Sophia Hale was proven to be the exception. After that dinner, something shifted between them. It was subtle, unspoken, yet undeniably present. He found himself noticing the way she moved through his office, the way she challenged him without fear, the way she was always there, not just as his assistant, but as someone who saw beyond the cold exterior he had spent years perfecting. And that was dangerous. One evening, long after the office had emptied, he found himself standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, staring at the city below. He had dismissed Sophia hours ago, yet he could still feel her presence lingering in his mind. The sound of the door opening made him turn. His breath caught slightly when he saw her. "I thought I told you to go home," he said, his voice lower than usual. Sophia, standing in the doorway with a file in her hand, raised an eyebrow. "And I thought you would have left by now." He exhaled slowly, watching as she stepped inside, placing the file on his desk. "You are working too much," she added, crossing her arms. "Even for you." A smirk tugged at his lips. "And now you're worried about me?" Sophia rolled her eyes. "I just do not want to deal with an overworked, irritable boss tomorrow." He should have let it go, should have allowed her to leave, to keep things professional. But instead, he took a step closer. The air between them grew heavier, something unspoken passing between them as she held his gaze. He could see it in her eyes, the same thing that had been haunting him for weeks. Attraction, connection, the undeniable pull that neither of them had acknowledged until this very moment. "You are different from the others," he said, his voice quieter now. Sophia's lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her face before she smiled. "And you are not as untouchable as you pretend to be." Alexander felt something stir deep within him, something he was not ready to face, because for the first time in 20 years he was standing dangerously close to losing control. Alexander had always believed that control was his greatest weapon. He had mastered the art of restraint, of keeping emotions locked away where they could not hurt him. But, standing this close to Sophia, with nothing but the city lights casting shadows around them, he realized that control was slipping through his fingers, and he was letting it. She was still watching him, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, curiosity, hesitation, and something far more dangerous. "You should go home," he finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. Sophia studied him for a long moment before responding. "Why do you push people away?" His jaw tightened. "I do not." A knowing smile ghosted across her lips. "You do, but for some reason you have not pushed me away yet." She was right, and they both knew it. Alexander could have dismissed her words, could have given her a cold, calculated response. But instead, he did something that shocked even himself. He told the truth. "I stopped letting people in a long time ago," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "It is easier that way." Sophia tilted her head slightly, as if she were peeling back the layers of the man the world only saw as ruthless and untouchable. "Easier does not mean better, Alexander." His name. She had never called him by his first name before. It sounded different coming from her, softer, more real. Something inside him cracked. Before he could stop himself, his hand lifted, fingers grazing the side of her face. She tensed slightly, but did not pull away. That was all the confirmation he needed. "I do not do this," he murmured, almost to himself. Sophia exhaled slowly, her gaze locked onto his. "Then why are you doing it now?" He had no answer, because everything about this, about her, defied the rules he had lived by for 20 years. And yet, for the first time, breaking those rules did not feel like a mistake. Alexander had spent 2 decades perfecting his defenses. Yet, with one touch, Sophia was dismantling them. His fingers lingered against her skin, his thumb brushing lightly along her cheekbone. He should have stepped back. He should have walked away. But standing here, inches from her, he could not. Sophia did not move, did not pull away. Instead, she held his gaze with quiet defiance, as if daring him to cross a line he had never crossed before, and he was dangerously close. "This is not who I am," he admitted, his voice raw. Sophia's lips parted slightly. "Then maybe it is time to stop being the man you were, and become the man you are meant to be." Her words cut through him in a way nothing ever had. For years, he had told himself that love was a weakness, that intimacy was a risk. But Sophia was not just a risk. She was a temptation, a force pulling him into the unknown. And, for the first time, he wanted to fall. His hand slid from her cheek, trailing down her arm before finally retreating. The loss of contact sent a sharp ache through his chest, but he ignored it. He had to. "You should go," he murmured, forcing the words out. Sophia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. But then, to his surprise, she did something he never expected. She took a step forward and whispered, "I am not afraid of you, Alexander." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, shattered, conflicted, and wanting more than he had ever allowed himself to before. As the door clicked shut behind her, Alexander let out a slow, unsteady breath. For the first time in 20 years, he felt something foreign, something dangerous. He felt alive. Alexander Knight had spent his life mastering control. But tonight, as he sat alone in his office, staring at the door Sophia had just walked through, he realized he was losing the very thing that defined him. He could still hear her voice. "I'm not afraid of you, Alexander." No one had ever said that to him before. People respected him, feared him, but Sophia, she saw him, the man beneath the power, beneath the walls, and what terrified him most was that he was starting to see himself through her eyes. For years, he had convinced himself that love was nothing more than a distraction, a weakness, something that could be controlled and avoided, like every other aspect of his life. But with her, it was different. He did not just want her, he was drawn to her, in a way that defied every rule he had lived by, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he crossed the line completely. The next morning, when Sophia walked into his office, she was as composed as ever, as if the night before had not shifted the very foundation of his world. "Your schedule for today," she said, placing the tablet on his desk. Alexander took it, but he did not look at the screen. He looked at her. She met his gaze, calm, unwavering, waiting for him to speak. He should have ignored what was happening between them, should have pretended nothing had changed. But then, in a low, deliberate voice, he said, "Cancel my evening meetings." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He stood, moving around the desk, closing the space between them. His voice was steady, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Because tonight, I'm taking you to dinner." Sophia blinked, momentarily speechless, but then a slow smile curved her lips, and just like that, the unshakable Alexander Knight fell. Not in battle, not in business, but for a woman who had changed everything.